Hello and welcome to AP Comparative Government. Today we're going to be talking about political institutions. Those are distinct from government institutions for reasons that I'll talk about in the next lecture. Political institutions are what are called linkage institutions. A linkage institution is defined as a group that connects the citizens to the government. This could be a political party, an interest group, or even the media. Now, I want to talk about party systems because party systems are going to be really important in understanding the differences in the class, the differences between the six countries. First of all, a party system is defined as an array of political parties in a nation state and the relationships between them. And the second part is kind of key in understanding the distinctions between these. Now, of course, in the most rudimentary sense, the most basic sense, you have what's called a one party system. Generally, these are old communist states or current ones, the exception being Mexico, which has one party, which is the PRI. PRI is something that I'll talk about a lot more later on. Then there's what's called a two party system. And this is actually the most unusual, which will come as a surprise to a lot of American students listening to this, because, of course, the United States utilizes a two party system. But really, the United States is in the minority here. Two party systems are utilized only in 15 total countries, one of which is the United States. So it really is the minority in this situation. Most European countries use what's called a multi party system. Multi party systems is kind of what it is. There's more than two political parties. And these usually arise in situations where you have proportional voting. Proportional voting is something I'm going to get to in just a second when I talk about the different ways in which people vote. Now, let's talk about electoral systems because a political party is oftentimes tied very closely to its electoral system. Again, on kind of a basic level, we're talking about the difference between a single member electoral system and a proportional electoral system. Single member electoral systems, examples of which are the United States, India, and Great Britain, are also called first past the post systems, or sometimes plurality systems. In each of these systems, which are just different names for the same thing, the candidates compete for a single district. The individual doesn't need to win a majority of the votes. They simply need to win a plurality. That's where the word plurality system comes from. That is, they need to win more votes than anyone else. Let me give you an example so you understand what I'm talking about. Let's just take a run of the mill district in Great Britain. Let's say it's a London district, and there's seven people running, and they split the vote fairly evenly. Nobody gets more than 17, 18%. In that situation, whoever has the highest percentage would win, even though they didn't get close to a majority of the total votes cast in that system. Now, opposite to this is what's called a proportional system. In a proportional system, more than one seat is contested in each district. Often, in these cases, voters cast their ballots for parties rather than individual candidates. So, this may be a situation where you have either a ranked choice voting system or a different style voting system where you rank the candidates. And so you have the option for more than one person in each district to win. There are advantages and disadvantages to each side. In a proportional system, you do tend to see more third party candidates being successful. So, in multi party states and multi party systems, proportional voting is probably what you're going to get. And then there's what are called mixed systems. Mixed systems combine elements from both single member and proportional electoral systems. These include, of our six countries, Mexico, and until 2007, Russia. In Mexico, a portion of the seats of the legislature is determined by first past the post or single member districts, and another portion is determined by proportional voting. Single member systems tend to favor two party systems because it's very unlikely that a third party candidate will win. On the other hand, proportional systems of voting encourage coalitions and minority parties because there's a much higher chance of winning at least a couple of seats. Now, this slide shows you very clearly the distinctions between the different types: single member, proportional, and mixed. And it shows you how the different systems themselves will oftentimes dictate the type of political outcome that you get. Single member is not likely to result in a multi party system. It just doesn't because of the way that it's designed. So, what does that mean for us as political scientists? It means we have to pay very close attention to the manner in which votes are cast, because that will oftentimes dictate the outcome. And it's something that's very worthwhile when it comes to the essays to dig into. Now, let's talk about types of elections then. So, we have electoral systems. What are different types of elections? Well, the first one is by far and away the most common and the one that you're going to be most familiar with, which is election of public officials. This is direct election. Whether it's proportional, mixed, or single member, you are directly voting for the person who's going to represent your interests. Good example, of course, is the United States. A referendum, on the other hand, is a national ballot called either, and that's the key, either by the citizens or the government. In Russia, for example, the president can call for a national referendum. This allows voters a direct voice in a major policy decision. Now, don't confuse these with what's called a plebiscite. A plebiscite is a non binding vote. Usually, you call a plebiscite in order to take a sort of national stock or a pulse of the nation. It's a way to figure out how to get people on your side. So, oftentimes, it's very much used by politicians as a way to gauge whether or not they have significant support for a particular initiative, or to show the country and a stubborn minority that this policy has overwhelming support and you need to get behind it. The last type is an initiative. An initiative is like a referendum, except an initiative can only be brought by the people. It cannot be brought by the government. It forces government action in some way. Next, I want to talk about interest groups because, of course, there's more ways to be politically active and there's more political institutions than just the people that we elect. Interest groups are organizations of like minded people who want to influence legislation and policy. We have a lot of these in the United States. We have environmental groups. We have people on the issue of firearms on both sides. And oftentimes there are interest groups on both sides of issues throughout the American system. Now, there's two big differences between interest groups and political parties because they're not the same, of course. Political parties initially try to influence policy through elections. That is, through the candidates that they run and that they hope to get elected. Interest groups, on the other hand, do not run their own candidates. A second difference is that while political parties often try to broaden their platforms to try to attract support, interest groups tend to be very focused on one or perhaps two issues. There is an exception here, though. In multi party systems, you do often see parties which focus on one or two issues. A great example is the rise of green parties throughout Europe. Now, interest groups function very differently in authoritarian states because there they have much less autonomy from the government. In China, for example, only recognized groups recognized by the party, by the People's Communist Party, are allowed to exist. There, these interest groups function as what are defined as transmission belts. i.e., groups that more or less exist to convey to their members the views of the party elite. Now, the opposite of this extreme is what we see in Western democracies. Their interest groups are autonomous. They elect their own leadership and they compete with each other for influence over the government. This is often called interest group pluralism, plural for more than one. In between these two extremes is a concept that's called corporatism. Here, fewer independent groups compete than under pluralism. Usually, there is one interest group per sector. So, labor, agriculture, energy, health and human services, etc. The group's monopoly over the sector is often approved and or sometimes protected by the state. There are two forms of corporatism: state and societal. In state corporatism, it is the government, it's the state that determines which interest groups are brought in. In societal corporatism, interest groups take the lead and oftentimes dominate the state. The last topic I want to talk about today are political elites and recruitment. Political elites are important in whatever political system that you have. What are they? Political elites are defined as leaders who have a disproportionate share of policy-making authority and power. All states of all types of government, whether they're democratic or authoritarian, have them. Different states have different ways these elites are recruited. And this is often tied into the concept called succession. Succession is defined as the process by which leaders are replaced when they resign, die, or are not elected again. This can be very legal in the case of, say, Great Britain. It can be very extra legal in the case of, say, China, where the party is going to dictate who succeeds who. Whereas in Great Britain, that choice is often left to the voters, to the people. But either way, both systems have political elites and systems of succession.